thank you, everybody, for joining me today. Um, I want to start on this little note, which is I'm very thankful for something. You see, it's kind of occurred to me. I've been able to breeze through the last 500 years of this because people were less literate, so less things were written. The next 500 years we're going to cover are going to be a little bit more packed because literacy is higher. So there's more historical records being kept. And of course, there's more things happening in the world. But never underestimate what a gift literacy is after experiencing the history of an era where it wasn't as common. So just to pick up from where we had previously left off, we had talked about this great crusade, the First Crusade, or the Prince's Crusade, as it is called. This campaign that was pulled together by Pope Urban II and several of the princes in Europe to prevent a hostile invasion into Europe and the downfall of Constantinople, and B, to recapture Jerusalem, which they ultimately succeeded in. But what we can see where we left off were the emergence of these crusader states. We now have 4 new entities. There's actually 5 if you count the Principality of Armenian Cilicia that have kind of formed as their own kingdoms. So this starts to create an interesting dynamic, as we're going to see, where you have these Frankish kingdoms that are in Asia Minor. And so you're going to start to see how that starts to create some interesting needs. How do you provide the logistical support for these states, which are all the way apart from mainland Europe and the interactions that come by? And then, of course, just to address the fact that they're not alone either. You still do have all of these Islamic caliphates that are outlying. So we'll start to get more into some of the changes of the era. Now, one of the most important things that we should really try to grasp with this is, I think, the severity of the situation. Because while these crusaders were ultimately successful, we have to remind ourselves that when they first embarked on this mission, they had about 75,000 that made up their number. Perhaps somewhere around 7,000 of those being knights, the rest being men-at-arms or armed pilgrims. And when this endeavor is over, the forces that remain, for one reason or another, many have perished, either from famine. There were plenty that deserted during the siege of Antioch, or the majority who do survive, they go home, because that's it. To them, it really was this idea of an indulgence that Pope Urban II had told them, if you go on this armed pilgrimage to save Constantinople and to liberate Jerusalem, then you will be forgiven your sins. So there's a lot of these crusaders who go on this, and that seems to have been a pretty sincere, authentic reason, because as soon as this is over, the lion's share of these forces just return home back to Europe. Which might be great for them, but it's terrible for the region, because what we see is that by the time this is over, there's about 300 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers left in Jerusalem's garrison. That's less than 3% of the initial total force that they originally started with, and now they're going to be in a land surrounded by enemies that they have just made over the course of these past few years. So this starts to prompt a little bit more of the era that we're going to see is be typical of the Crusades. And one of the first things that we're going to see is that there's this emergency conference that happens. Godfrey of Bouillon is king, and he summons together a council, the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, and they get together all the knights that they can who are left in the city, because at this point there's only about 300 of them left. And they say, we have a big problem. The bulk of forces have gone home. We're entirely surrounded. And even while being surrounded, we're divided because we have all these different crusader states now, each one kind of just tending to its own matters. What do we do about this? So they formed this order called the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's going to be the first of what we begin to see as military orders. Orders of knights that are given the very specific purpose of somehow being involved in the protection of the Crusader states or the Holy Land. But these knights, this first military order, isn't really exceptional in terms of what will come later, because they kind of just make up the constituency of the knights who are left. And they're just trying to organize as best as they can to really oversee the kingdom of Jerusalem. And then, of course, 1100, Godfrey de Bouillon, he dies. And we end up seeing the next king of Jerusalem. Whereas Godfrey was humble, he would only call himself the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His brother Baldwin, remember, also Prince of Edessa, has no problems calling himself king of Jerusalem. Becomes established right away. He has his own political campaign that he is a part of. We won't go into too much detail on that. Suffice to say, there is regime change. And then I mentioned the military orders, which we're going to get into a little bit more. This is something that is very significant for this era. I think it's something that also speaks to the role of the church in this era. It sort of starts with the Holy Sepulchre, but as we see, there'll be several others. We'll see the Hospitallers, the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knight Order. There's the Knights of St. Lazarus. There's plenty of them. But this is new. This is new, and this is different for several reasons. The first being, again, up until this time, you used a war chest. You used a garrison. Most of the time, kings would break into a set of funds to raise lances or war bands during a time of warfare. So the idea of having something like these military orders is now something on par with what today we would consider like special forces, like forces that are impeccably trained all throughout the year, that have vast logistical and networks to be able to support their sustainment in the theater, which is going to be in the Levant, in the Middle East. And what we will also see is we're going to see a kind of break of an earlier category we talked about, ora et labora, those who work and those who pray. And of course, we talked about a third class of society, those who fight. We had always, in medieval Europe, kind of put them in their own category. But what happens when you start to have something now that is one who fights and one who prays at the same time? This is going to become a new concept in Christianity. So we're just going to talk about a few of these really quick. Blessed Gerard Sasso, he is a very important priest who is actually in charge of the St. John's Hospital, which is in Jerusalem. And during the First Crusade, he actually finds himself in a very interesting position because the the Fatimid Caliphate that is occupying Jerusalem, remember, they had just pushed the Turks out. They do not trust Christians in the city because they see the big Christian crusade coming, which, to be fair, is a pretty logical conclusion to draw. And especially because we saw what happened at the Siege of Antioch, where one of the denizens had been bribed to let one of the towers down so that the city could be invaded. There's sort of a wholesale eviction of all the Christian population within the city at the time leading up to the capture of Jerusalem. This individual, though, he still has to run a hospital. There's still the sick, there's still the injured, there's still all those who are needing to be helped. And in the midst of everything that happens after being ejected from the city, almost immediately after reorganizing and taking the city, there is a section of the city that gets breached by a counteroffensive, and it happens to be right where the hospital is in the Amalfistan district. So these clerics, those working the hospital, actually take up arms and actually successfully manage to defend this section of the city. And they actually become one of the first of the Knight Orders, the Knights Hospitaller, or the Knights of St. John. These are like your medieval medics, basically. Very versed in medicine. We owe a lot of modern medicine, modern hospitals, and the models that we have for hospitals actually to them. Their philanthropy is pretty much the domain of establishing more of these hospitals throughout the Near East. So when we talk about some of the things we actually get from the Crusades period, the idea of the modern hospital is something that really gets made up from this. But there's still sort of a problem. You have these Knights of the Holy Sepulchre who are managing affairs in the city. And you have this newly formed order of the Knights of the Hospital. But what are you going to do about the roads? The pilgrim roads are really unprotected. 300 nights is not enough to really be able to do much about that. And you have all the stretch of land going all the way back through the Levant, through Anatolia, that is now just prime territory for raiding. You have all sorts of bandits and raiders that are now besetting the pilgrims that are on this road, whether they're Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. It's now kind of become a land of lawlessness. And because there isn't much in terms of local defense, it attracts more marauders than it ever had before. So that's where we're going to get into what I feel is a very critical part of the period. And as you will see, there's a reason I choose to focus on this particular group so much. We have one of these Knights of the Holy Sepulchre named Hugh de Payens. He is somebody who had been on the First Crusade under Tancred. He had witnessed a lot of this, and he's one of those knights that elected to stay when everybody else decided to go home. And his perspective on this was, this is very much our fault. we helped contribute to this. While it was necessary to reclaim Jerusalem, we've ran into the problem of having destabilized the region, and there needs to be a better method to this than just having local knights in the city. What really needs to happen is there needs to be an organization that would be dedicated strictly to guarding the pilgrim roads. And so in 1119, Hugh de Payens and we could say his best friend Godfrey de Saint-Omer, two of these knights, they approach the new king Baldwin II and Patriarch Warmund, and they create a new order called the Poor Knights of Christ. And again, the whole idea is this is going to be an armed militia that is dedicated completely to safeguarding these pilgrim roads and these routes leading to Jerusalem. And Patriarch Warmund does them one better. They are given quite an impressive headquarters on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and it's actually situated over what is thought to have been the place of the original Temple of Solomon. Having been there myself, back from my old days in archaeology, I spent some time in the old city. The Temple Mount is actually just adjacent to the Western Wall. Sometimes you'll hear people call it the Wailing Wall, but we try to stay away from that language. That's actually something derogatory and defamatory. So if you're ever in Israel, people will prefer the Western Wall. It's one of the last sections of wall from Herod's temple. But above it here, you get this mosque. There's the Dome of the Rock, which is right across from it, and it's built on the place that Muslims believe Muhammad ascended into heaven. It is also thought to have been built over the place where the binding of Isaac had occurred. Yet across from it is this middle building, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and for quite some time that was the headquarters of this new organization. And they gain this new name, the Papares Camilitones Christi Templique Salomonici, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. That's a mouthful, and so people condense it, and so you probably know them better as the Templars. And that's how they actually come about as an organization. They kind of represent this type of new Frank that we will see plays a really important role. They come from the culture of these first crusaders who, having spent enough time in the city, being aware enough of a lot of the problems in the area, they're really some of the most informed veterans. They understand who the cultures are. They understand who the people are. They understand what the problems of the time are. And we will continue to see how that plays a massive role. And they also have quite an amazing patron. One of the biggest influences is the head of the Benedictine order at the time, the Cistercian order of monks in Europe. His name's Saint Bernard de Clairvaux. And Bernard de Clairvaux pulls so much weight in Europe that the nickname people give him is the Pope Maker. The idea that if you want to be Pope, you need this guy's endorsement. Well, Saint Bernard de Clairvaux writes a book called In Praise of the New Knighthood that gets sent and published widely. And it's his take on how he feels that this new organization of the Knights Templar is going to be an ideal asset to society. But what's interesting is that instead of your regular type of fighting men, he prescribes them underneath the rule of Benedict, which is the rule that monks would oblige by. So to be a Knight Templar, you had to live by poverty, chastity, and obedience. You had to give away your property. You could not marry. You gave up everything in order to join this order. And so you have this idea of a very spiritual type of knight that has essentially forsaken the material completely. There's actually some correlation here in the way that the order's original name is the Poor Knights of Christ. You'll see that their motif, their symbol, if you will, for a very long time is two knights on one horse, because supposedly Godfrey de Saint-Omer and Hugh de Payens were so poor initially that they had only one horse to share. And thanks to St. Bernard's patronage, many people regard them as a good thing. They spark popularity all across Europe. They start getting royal endorsements from all the different monarchs within Europe who view them as a very good cause, which gives them the means, the infrastructure, and the manpower to do something that really has not been done before. And so today you can actually visit all of these sites for what they call the Templar Trail, which are all the means by which a person wanting to go to the Holy Land, as far as Dijon, France, could take this trail and have these networks. Again, it's also kind of interesting because the Templars kind of develop our concept of modern police. The idea that you have posts along the way with a sheriff and some deputies that actually safeguard that area. They become, as I've mentioned, quite politically astute. They are quite heavily financially backed as an institution. They become quite a big deal. And I mentioned, too, they start to develop this reputation. They develop this reputation for being a very multicultural organization. Whereas you constantly have new Franks coming to Jerusalem who are very ignorant of the culture, the Templars are they have this affinity with just about everybody for being very mindful. And so I've actually included something here which is from a Muslim. It's from a chronicler named Usama ibn Munkik. And he writes this about them. He says, "Whenever I went to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, I would go in and make my way up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, beside which stood a small mosque that the Franks had converted into a church. When I went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque where the Templars, who are my friends, were, they would clear out that little mosque so I could pray in it. One day I went into the little mosque reciting the opening formula, 'God is great,' and stood up in prayer. At this time, one of the Franks rushed at me and grabbed me and turned my face towards the east, saying, 'Pray like this.' A group of Templars hurried towards him, took hold of the Frank, and took him away from me. I then returned to my prayers. The Frank, that very same one, took advantage of their inattention and returned, rushing upon me and turning my face to the east, saying, 'Pray like this.' So the Templars came in and again grabbed him and threw him out. They apologized to me, saying, 'This man is a stranger, just arrived from Frankish lands sometime in the past few days. He has never before seen anyone who did not pray towards the east.'" So despite what we see in some of our popular media, or like films directed by Ridley Scott, we actually have an account of the Templars really going out of their way to protect minorities, which is something that they develop quite a reputation for. They're known, there's written accounts of them actually defending Jews and Muslims from other crusading Franks in the areas that they're assigned to. Significance here, though, is it kind of represents interfaith development, an understanding of other people's faith, and remember those Eastern Christians that had sort of been a surprise to the Crusaders when they came into the East. They also do something else that's really important for us that gets put in society. They start to realize that the biggest deterrent for raids on the pilgrim roads is to remove people's money. If people are going from Western Europe to Jerusalem and they're carrying a cartload of gold and silver and all their stuff, well, that's going to be a high priority target for bandits. So they come up with a new method. They actually create these Templar commanderies in Europe, where if you're a pilgrim, you would simply go in, you would give them your money, and then they would give you a chit or a ticket that had been written in cipher. When you go to Jerusalem, you turn it into the commandery and you withdraw all your money there. Basically, it's the idea of the checking system that we use in modern banking. And of course, there's an interest fee for using that system, but we get our notion of modern banking also from this. So all of this spread movement, the traversing of these pilgrim roads leads to a lot of people engaging in culture in the Middle East. But it also results in a lot of that culture coming back. And one of the things we will see is that with kind of the interplay that's happening between the Frankish and Arabic world in terms of trade, in terms of architecture, in terms of exchange, we really see the Gothic movement in Europe start to take off almost directly after. So we get things like the great cathedrals in Europe occurring as a result of this cultural exchange and knowledge. So I've included here as an example Notre Dame de Chartres and Westminster Abbey. We also see the rise of mendicant orders at this time that I feel are equally as important to discuss. Anyone want to guess who the figure on the left is? Yes, St. Francis of Assisi. Excellent. How about the one on the right? Any guesses there? That's St. Dominic. So, but what both of these two people represent is something new that sort of happens around this exact same time. They play such a big role in what they're doing because at a time where the church is starting to become more extravagant, where you're getting these bigger cathedrals, where you're getting all this wealth coming in from the East, they're rejecting much of the wealth. They're rejecting a lot of the material obsession that's happening in society. Which is interesting because those who've been with me a few courses back might recall when we talked about the anchorites, the Byzantine hermits that went into the desert. They're almost doing something similar. They're rejecting a lot of the ostentatiousness of the period, and as a result, they become the most popular. St. Francis ends up creating the Franciscan order of monks. St. Dominic creates the Dominicans. And when it comes to pull with the average people, there's more favorability that go towards these mendicant orders than most of their native clergy. So I bring these organizations up, the Templars, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, because they represent in some ways a counterculture to the church or a different way of presenting church life through a model of asceticism. But we also get other things too, troubadours. So there was a golden opportunity that kind of started. During the First Crusade, all of these crusaders were very pious, and they came and they left for the Middle East. And some of these musicians decided, this is a great time for me to go into the court and try to win over this guy's wife while he's gone, and then I can be the new lord of the manor. So you have a whole provocative age of music that starts to develop as a result. And then once the First Crusade has completed, you start to have Arabic instruments that get introduced into the West. So music starts to experience a lot here. I regret that in this session today, I don't have the time or bandwidth to go into the Italian Renaissance, but something I would like to say about the Middle Ages, it often gets pitched as being a time of darkness and then the Renaissance. It's really not. It's a lot of little tinier Renaissances strewn in between, and a lot of these earlier Renaissances occur as a direct result of the cultural exchange in the Crusades. But now we're getting back to conflict, because that's everybody's favorite subject here. We have an individual named Ahmad Dane, and he's the Atabeg of Mosul in Aleppo. And he is who we're going to really start to see as being our first jihadist. He is the first figure that's going to try to take all of the outlying Islamic states and try to unite them against the Crusaders. He is actually going to see it as a holy war rather than just territorial defense. So we're beginning to see where things sort of shift backwards from where they were before. Whereas before the Crusaders were united and they came against a really divided Islamic world, now the tables are turning. Now you actually have a united Islamic world that's addressing these divided Crusader states and, of course, the Byzantine Empire. So he starts making huge waves, and one of the first things that he really leads up to is one of the first Crusader states that was established, Edessa, gets besieged and destroyed almost immediately by him. So this sort of prompts action from Europe. One of the most, I think, unsung heroes of this era that I think is an incredible figure that popular media just never talks about is Fulk of Anjou. Fulk of Anjou pretty much takes up this cause immediately, goes into Europe with an army to try to stop this this catastrophe from occurring when nobody else is taking up arms to do anything about this. He has sort of the foresight to say, like, there's not a huge garrison here. These people are going to get steamrolled if we don't do something about it. He ends up becoming this magnificent negotiator, by the way. Something that is really special about this period with Fulk is he ends up creating an alliance with Syria once he comes into Jerusalem. It's not short after he becomes king of Jerusalem himself. And this is something I like to share because I think it challenges the modern perception we have of the Crusades era as being strictly Christian versus Muslim. There is actually a Atabag of Damascus named Menedine. Menedine and Fulk actually create an alliance against Zengi, and it's known as the Franco-Damascene Alliance. So you have this period where there's a lot of dynamic trade and strict military alliances happening with Christians and Muslims against this other group of Muslims who's actually, fun fact, being somewhat tolerated and maybe even financially helped by the Byzantine Empire because they don't like these Crusader states being there. They begin to establish a lot of castles. They begin to establish a line of defense in the south, places like Blanchegard, Ibelin, and Acre. Acre is a port city that will become extremely important as we go forward. And again, I've been to some of these places. I actually worked survey sites on them. That's Tel Safi. That's where the Blanchegard, the White Castle, was once located. That was one of the Templar fortresses. But we see in the engagements here too, Islam's really starting to become very organized. So the Templars, we think of them as being this elite fighting force. Well, the Islamic world had its own equivalent, which were called the Mamluks. And the Mamluks are going to become just as important as the Templars, if not more. The Mamluks are slaves. They're slaves that are taken from childhood and are forced to be soldiers. They are pretty much bred from the age of 7 or whenever they've been enslaved to be the ultimate fighters on horseback. And as time goes along, what ends up happening is a lot of these Mamluks later become promotable to become generals. But at this time period, at least, the Mamluks become the counterpart to a lot of these crusading military orders. So, of course, we have a need for a second crusade now, because in 1143, King Fulk of Jerusalem dies from a freak hunting accident. If any of you read about, how many of you read Game of Thrones? Yeah. King Robert Baratheon dying in a boar accident takes some inspiration from Fulk. His rival, Ahmad din Zengi, the first proto-jihadist, he dies just 3 years later. He's actually assassinated by a Frankish slave. And he is succeeded by his son, Ahmad din Zengi. And Ahmad din continues to lead this jihad. And in the midst of all of this, Meheneddin, the Emir of Damascus, he switches sides. He actually goes from Jerusalem's side over to Zengi's side. So as you can imagine, this creates a massive panic. And so a new crusade is being launched in Europe. It's really being preached by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And some of the kings that we respond to this one are King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad II of the Holy Roman Empire. They organize forces and they decide to, try to stave off this rolling tide. Only this one does not go as successfully as the First Crusade does. They target Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. And there's some commentary on this where one of the Templar Grandmasters, Everard de Barras, really tried to inform King Louis VII not to go in a certain approach for the siege, which the king did anyways, and it resulted in an ambush from the flanks, and they got pushed outside the city, ultimately unable to take Damascus, ultimately unable to regain Edessa, And so there is the news coming back to Europe that this Second Crusade has not succeeded. In the chaos of all of this, we're going to move forward several years. Again, I don't have too much time to go as in depth in these as I would like to, but we do need to talk about a major figure. There's Ahmad ad-Din, and then there's Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din has a general in his army named Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Yusuf ibn Ayyub sees his opportunity, whereas Ahmad ad-Din trusted him to sort of be a strong support for Nur ad-Din. He takes advantage of Nur ad-Din's weakness and actually usurps. He ends up taking over as the leader of the Zengid dynasty, removes the dynasty part, ends up creating what's called the Ayyubid Caliphate. He ends up changing his name to a name that may be familiar to some people here, Salahuddin Ayyubi, or Saladin. Saladin ends up forming this new conglomerate. Salahuddin, by the way, in Arabic means the light of Islam. So you have this figure that is almost very much seen like a prophet figure who is really starting to centralize and organize a lot of the Arab world together. He spends a lot of that actually with internal conflict against Syria, against Damascus, and also against Baghdad. And it's kind of interesting because if you think about modern politics today, you have Syria, you typically have Iran, Iraq, and then Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, and they're usually not all in agreement with each other. And then you kind of have like the state of Israel that's in between, that's dealing with everything on all sides. That's really just kind of how it's always been. Even though the names have changed, it's always been those pocket groups really competing with each other. So there's that saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And that is very much the case, as we'll see with conflicts in the Near East. But Salahuddin does something very impressive as a leader that I'm not sure in history we really see again till someone like Otto von Bismarck. He's very competent in identity politics. And what he realizes is that if you can go and conquer all the small groups and then give them a big target to focus on, they'll actually accept the regime change more and wanting to go forward that. So he is somebody that actually sees the Crusades and the Crusaders as a golden ticket. It's his way of unifying the Islamic world and then giving it a goal to go towards, which for him is recapturing Jerusalem. And there's a story with Salah ad-Din about how he supposedly had a near-death experience from a heart attack, but survived and claimed that he had had a vision from Allah that it was that Islam was being punished for its sins, but could redeem it by capturing Jerusalem, which is very interesting because it's not far from what was originally being preached by Christians in the West. We also see the rise of a new king of Jerusalem. Again, we're kind of skipping past a lot of the political currents for the sake of time. Anybody who's seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven by Ridley Scott will be very familiar with this conflict. There is another king named Baldwin IV. Baldwin IV proves to be one of the more competent kings of Jerusalem and contends with possibly the largest number of obstacles, which is quite amazing. He not only deals with the more fractured Crusader states with less support from Europe, he also is diagnosed with leprosy and is dealing with being a leper at the same time that he is trying to manage the kingdom of Jerusalem. And when he's only 16 years old, Salah ad-Din leads a major offensive into a place called Montjazard. The site of that castle where I showed you I had previously worked as an archaeologist in Israel, it's actually just the field right beyond that. It's in antiquity, it was known as Azekah. It's the place where David fought with Goliath. But in 1177, it's Montjazard. This great fight happens, and at 16 years old, Baldwin is able to actually defeat Salah ad-Din. One of the ways that he does it is actually Saladin has the upper hand initially and is pushing forward with looting. And from the rear flank, the Templars actually came in and drove Saladin out. So this marks something different too with these military orders. They're no longer just people protecting the Pilgrim Road. They're now becoming the backbone of the military. They're becoming very essential to these operations as well. Unfortunately, there's a number of truces that go back and forth between Baldwin IV and Salah ad-Din. He's a very capable leader, but he does eventually succumb to leprosy, and he does die. His son is poisoned. There's an interim leader, that Raymond of Tripoli, that doesn't last long. And eventually we get to this individual, Guy de Lisunion. And Guy de Lisunion becomes king in 1186, and within a year becomes responsible for the fall of Jerusalem. A big part of the reason is this fellow here named Renaud de Chatillon, a prince of Antioch, which is where Bohemond of Toronto is from. I don't know why that's where all the pirate people like to go, but this guy's MO was raiding the, caravans and things like that. He was so universally unliked. There's some evidence to suggest the Templars may have tried to work with the Hashishans to have him assassinated at one point. You're a pretty bad person for that to happen. Ultimately unsuccessful, it provokes another war with Salah ad-Din. And then we have this disastrous event in 1197 called the Battle of Hattin. Instead of defending the city of Jerusalem, Guy de Lisunion and Renaud de Chatillon decide to take the whole crusading force out, march it into the Negev, into the desert, to confront Salah ad-Din's army, something that more of the competent minds really advise against. As they march along, they find all the water sources have been poisoned. And I will say this, to Guy de Lusignon's defense, earlier in his career, he was a marshal of the military of Jerusalem, and there was an incident called the Field of Blood, where he did decide to play too defensive, and he did decide to stay too close to fortifications, and it cost him a battle that ended up being a very bloody mess. So there's some historical research that thinks that the impetus for this was Guy de Lisunion was afraid of that same type of event happening. So he genuinely thought in earnest this would be a better solution. It wasn't. The Crusaders get almost entirely annihilated in this event. The Jerusalem becomes entirely prone. Guy de Lisunion is captured. Renaud de Chatillon is executed. And that leads the path to Jerusalem wide open. And that leads to the fall of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187. Which is quite a remarkable event. There's an individual named Balian of Ibelin who manages to hold a defense of this city to the point that it leads Salah ad-Din to come to terms with him despite being severely outnumbered. And they end up negotiating safe passage for all the civilians within the city to fully leave Jerusalem. So what do you think happens after this? Any guesses? That's right. I heard a third crusade. That's right. We have another one because now there's more people in Europe hearing that this has happened. They're having the knee-jerk reaction to it. And now there's going to be another crusade launched to reclaim Jerusalem. This will become a very repetitive theme here pretty soon. But this time it's going to be led by 3 individuals in Europe. And the Pope really has to navigate this well because all 3 of these men are rivals. But the first is arguably the most powerful, Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, literally in German, the Redbeard. He's emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, has the most total amount of forces. He manages to get the King of France, King Philip II Augustus, and Richard Plantagenet, who becomes known as Richard Coeur de Lion, or as you probably know him, Richard the Lionheart from England. They all agree to go on this. And Richard is probably the most obsessed because his father, Henry I, was one of the crusaders that actually deserted during Antioch in the First Crusade. So he finds that there is a very, very important need to try to regain England's honor in this situation. And so the forces converge, they start to go into the Holy Land, and one of the most ironic things in history happens. Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, he was one of the most territorial rulers for his time, tried to take over a good portion of what was Italy under the premise that it used to be part of Charlemagne's empire. is after a city called Vienna, but is so nervous about getting there because there's a river in the way. And the prophetess and Christian mystic Hildegard von Bingen had shared a prophecy, a vision in which she foretold that he would die from drowning in a river. So he would never actually cross himself into Vienna because he was so paranoid about that happening. Well, it just so happens while crossing the Jordan River into Jerusalem, he got his foot stuck at a rock after falling off his horse and drowned in the Jordan River. So they're immediately off to a great start. The Germans, of course, they kind of remain in force, but it really just leads two people left, Philip II Augustus and King Richard the Lionheart, which is sort of an issue because those two have been competing over land back in Europe. So you have two very high rivals that are now having to work together to coordinate this. And to their credit, they do so quite successfully initially. Acre, which is the big port city, had been overtaken by Saladin's forces. They managed to get it back, and quite a spectacular siege in 1191. But then Richard the Lionheart really has his work cut out for him. And he's one of these figures in history I am so fascinated with because he did so much with so little and with so much pressure. Because what happens after this is King Philip II Augustus very conveniently decides to return back to France and start profiteering Richard's little cousin John against him to try to weaken the state of England. Just so you know, Richard was so passionate about this, he literally sold London in order to fund this crusade. So he now has trouble back home, and he has a ticking time bomb. He knows that there's only so long he can actually spend on this crusade before he needs to get back home to Europe. There's several engagements that happen. Richard actually comes this close to capturing Jerusalem. He becomes that fierce of a rival to the point that we now know today from Arabic records that he had formed an alliance with Salah ad-Din's brother. His own vassals were against Saladin, and people started fleeing the city because they didn't think they had the manpower left to defend the city. The story goes that Richard gets 5 miles outside the walls of Jerusalem, tosses up his cloak, and says, "I will not look upon that which I cannot conquer," because he doesn't think he has the forces to do it. And it turns out he probably could have. But on his way back, while he's near the port city of Jaffa, they get attacked again by the Saracens, and a very furious Richard comes forth in the battle and ends up racking up such a kill count in his battle that there's sort of this legendary mystique that the Arab world starts to assign to him. And so we start to end up with a really interesting dynamic that happens, which is, in the West, Richard the Lionheart is kind of thought of as being a poor king. He's thought of being this derelict king that just abandoned England and left it to crisis to pursue this crusade. But in the Arabic world, he's seen as this almost divinely sent, competent leader and warrior that's worthy of respect. Whereas what's very interesting is there's a tomb right there of Salah ad-Din that's actually made by one of the Kaisers of Germany. Because in Europe, Salah ad-Din becomes seen as the pinnacle of chivalry based on the fact that he let people leave Jerusalem unharmed, that he always kind of fought on these fair terms. So you have this, but yet at the same time, in the Arabic world, he's kind of despised. He's seen as an usurper that really ran the political machine. So you kind of have this odd situation where both of these leaders are more respected by the opposite culture than their domestic one. On his way back, King Richard is betrayed and captured by Duke Leopold of Austria. If you ever study medieval history, I'll give you a tip. Never trust anybody named Leopold. They're bad news. In almost every case, every person named Leopold just causes problems. It's just, you just don't trust anyone named Leopold. And as we've learned from the last session too, never trust anyone named Peter either, for that matter. This leads into an event in England that I just want to give a little bit of a nudge to, the First Barons' War. With Richard being gone, John becomes such a tyrannical king that it actually prompts his nobles into action against him. The Templars are actually involved in this conflict, and it results in something called the Magna Carta. And because this is ultimately leading towards the English Reformation, this is not something I can gloss over. The Magna Carta forces the king's hand to provide the nobles with parliamentary powers. So we're starting to see shifts that are coming in political currents as well from all of these events, where a king doesn't just have a hereditary rule. Much like the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Holy Roman Empire, the king is now expected to handle things in a parliamentary manner. That means having those within a senate, so to speak. So it's less absolute monarchy. It's more, I don't want to say a republic, but akin to one. All right, we're fast forwarding quite a bit here. There's 4 more crusades, 5 to 6 more, depending on who you ask. I really just don't have the time to go into all of them. If anybody has questions about them at another point, you can ask me about it. But today we're going to talk about Pope Innocent III, or as historians like to call him, Pope Not So Innocent. This marks something that is of key significance, because up to now, we've really seen the Christianity in the West develop in a way where it seems like it's had a lot of legitimate enterprises. It really has, even in its most radical movements, attempt to really come up with a justified basis for things. A lot of this starts to change under Pope Innocent. One of the first disasters that happens under him is that another crusade is orchestrated after Richard comes home. This one, however, is not orchestrated by the Pope. It's actually orchestrated by the Pope, by the Doge of Venice. The Doge is essentially the leader of Venice. And he sends a crusade to assist the Byzantine Empire, who once more is under attack. And they do. They show up and they succeed in quelling off the invading Saracen forces. However, the Byzantine Empire, as usual, is broke and can't pay them back. So the Doge just orders the Crusaders to sack the city of Constantinople in order to pay for reparations. This will mark the total end of trust between the Western nations and the Byzantine Empire. It's something that even in Greek culture is still discussed to this day. And then to make matters worse, we start to get into the 1200s, and we really see Crusader ideology start to really morph into something else. If we recall, the original crusade was tasked with reclaiming a city and preventing an invasion into Europe. Pope Innocent III has differences with a group of Christians called the Cathars that are starting to rise in Europe. The Cathars have a set of different beliefs, a lot of which concern things like reincarnation of the soul, things which are a lot of things which do not sit with regular Western Catholicism. And so he leads a crusade against them, actually calls a crusade against heretics called the Albigensian Crusade. And in one of the most possibly macabre scenes in the Middle Ages, at one of their main chateaus, all the Cathars are burned alive at the stake. And one of the commanders is quoted as saying, "Cedita eos novit inem dominus qui sunt eos." Kill them all, God will sort them out. That's the level of kind of shift in change that we're starting to see by this time period. Whoops. It represents to me, I think, a fundamental shift. The Crusades have gone from how do you defend the Holy Land to anyone who is an enemy of the Pope can be declared an enemy of the Church, and military action can be taken against them. At the same time this is happening, I didn't want to focus too much time on the entirety of the Crusades, but I will at least tell you how it ends. I mentioned those elite soldiers early on called the Mamluks. And let's just do a memory check here. Does anybody remember what Mamluks were, how they started? Slaves, that's right. They start as slaves and they're raised until adulthood to become these powerful fighters and generals. Well, eventually what happens is enough of them become generals that they actually start a mutiny. There is actually quite literally a Mamluk uprising of the slaves rebelling in Cairo and rebelling against the Arabic world, and they actually succeed in overthrowing the Ayyubid Caliphate. So overnight, there's actually a slave rebellion of these Mamluks that replaces it with what becomes the Mamluk Empire. And the Mamluks just become an unstoppable force. They end up having such power behind them at such an imperative time that they're able just to pretty much drive the Crusaders out of all their remaining fortifications and remaining cities. I've included here an account of one of the Grand Masters of the Templars, Guillaume de Zonac, just to describe to you how perilous this fighting gets. He is famous because at the Battle of Manessa, trying to defend pilgrims so that they could get out safely, he lost one of his eyes. At the Battle of Mansoura, he lost the other eye. And at a final battle, he died fighting blind. So you get into the state where the fall of the Crusader settlements finally ends with the Siege of Acre. When you take this city, that's it. You can no longer, it's a port city, and it's what the Crusaders relied on to keep bringing in reinforcements. So once Baibars took this city from that's the leader of the Mamluk Sultanate, the Crusades more or less officially come to an end. Which leads to what we're going to get into with shifts in Europe. The continuity of everything that we witnessed is going to lead to what becomes one of the largest conspiracies in history, and which I think has such powerful second and third order effects that it will eventually lead to the form of the Roman Catholic Church that we experience in Europe that begs the Protestant Reformation. So this is an individual named Philip IV, or Philip the Fair. He is the King of France, and he comes up with a very unique solution for his time. Philip the Fair has a couple problems. First of all, France is massively in debt. Multiple King Louis before him were involved in the Crusades and launched these long campaigns trying to take back the Holy Land with no success. They often borrowed the money from the Templars or from other backers in Europe to be able to do so. So France is in a significant amount of debt during his reign. He's also dealing with territorial disputes with England and with the Kingdom of Navarre, which is right next door. And he sees an opportunity in which he can probably try to invade England. Right at the same time, King Henry Longshanks ends up passing away. Some of you might know him as being the oppressor king that executed William Wallace. Well, he was Philip IV's greatest rival, and with his rival out of the way, there's an opportunity, and he has less checks on him to be able to fulfill his agenda, except he has one problem: the Pope, Boniface. And he comes up with a pretty simple solution. Let's assassinate him. Pope Boniface is reasonably trying to manage these marriage alliances to prevent conflict. The idea of what we would later call the 100 Years' War is his biggest nightmare. That's what he is trying to prevent, is this conflict between France and England, which he sees as an inevitability in the future. And of course, the papacy has the power of excommunication. Backed by Pope Innocent III now, being excommunicated means a lot more than no longer being in the church's favor. If you get on the church's wrong side enough, they might just declare a crusade against you, and you might end up being the next Cathars. Through a long series of complications, using a servant named William of Nogaret, Pope Boniface is poisoned in 1303, which results in this, the Avignon papacy. What happens is, now that the Pope is dead, the cardinal in the church that gets elected the next pope is Philip the Fair's best friend since childhood, Clement V. And so you have a pope that is actually the best friend of a king that has only become pope because the previous pope was assassinated by that king. And this papacy becomes known as the Avignon papacy because this pope is not even allowed to be in Rome. He's not allowed to be in St. Peter's Basilica. He is only allowed to stay in Avignon, France. That way the king can always watch over him and can always make sure that he's being obedient. So we have a very significant problem here. The papacy has almost entirely been taken over by the French government at this point. And then we have something that shocks the minds of Europe even more. France has the problem of its debt. And so to resolve this, King Philip the Fair raises what seems like a reasonable proposition at the time. He says, Well, these crusades are no longer happening. We no longer have these areas and territories in the Holy Land that need to be protected. So why exactly do we have these massive amounts of commanderies and forces that are still wielded by the Templars? And so he proposes that they meet with the Knights Hospitaller to discuss merging and actually kind of consolidating resources that they can be more manageable. So naturally, the Templar Grandmaster Jacques de Molay agrees to meet at this conference, and in 1307, Friday the 13th, henceforth considered an unlucky day, Philip the Fair actually has the Templars' leadership arrested. That's about Jacques de Molay and about 69 of the top commanders throughout the different regions. They are subjected to about 2 years of torture, in which they are tortured into giving false confessions of things like devil worship, of sodomy, of things like this. And despite recanting, they appeal to Pope Clement. Pope Clement refuses to exonerate them, and we actually now, as of 2005, have articles from the Vatican written by Clement that actually give an account of how he felt they were innocent, but he didn't have a choice. So they end up getting burned alive. Papal bulls go all across Europe calling for their immediate arrest and execution. It's one of the biggest conspiracies in history. And it's also one of the biggest mysteries, because when Philip the Fair went to the Templar fleets to try to confiscate all of their treasure or all the commanderies in Switzerland, they were gone. So they've kind of melded into the rest of history and probably helped with some other uprisings. Things only continue to get worse there, though, my friends. I know you were thinking it might get better, but you're wrong, because the Black Death happens. The Black Death rages through in 1347, and it is so devastating that it actually kills 80% of the population in Europe. And the repercussions of this are something that are widely identified and researched now. But just to give you an idea of the continuity shifts that you're seeing here, if you were maybe a peasant living in this time, not only are you living in a world where it seems that the Holy Land has been lost, you're not just living in a world where it seems that the Pope can condemn anyone he doesn't like. The Pope is a puppet to the French king. The Templars have been destroyed. But now you've lost like 80% of the people you know to the Black Plague. Now there's also a shift in work dynamics, because we see serfdom start to be imposed. There is such a deficit now in the amount of people that can do skilled labor like agriculture. They start to demand an increase in their wages. And the response that happens to this is that a lot of the monarchies all throughout Europe reinforce serfdom. The contract changes. The social contract used to be a pretty good deal. Imagine if you were told, hey, the government is saying that if for like 3 months of the summer you maintain a farm field, they will give you free housing and free food for the rest of the year. The rest of that time you can explore for your own enterprises or purposes. And then suddenly that gets mutated to you live here, you can't leave here, and the next 5 generations after you will also be serfs here. Being a peasant starts to become something equivocal to being a slave in most of the world. And the problem is the bishops, who are landowners themselves, who own bishop lands and diocesan lands, are also seen to be part of the problem. They're also seen to be people that are manipulating the labor crisis that's happening. In several different instances, we end up getting peasant revolts. One of the most famous happens in 1381, where we see an uprising of the British Commonwealth against the king, succeeds at a certain point in abducting the king before sparing him, but dispatch a lot of those that they feel are corrupt, including members of the church. Other armed conflicts happen throughout Europe. All right. Things are not good. I think we can agree on that. Things are not looking good. And that's coming from a class where objectively we've said from day one things might not always look good. It's looking worse than it usually does. Well, it gets even better, because in 1407 there's now a schism. That Avignon papacy, there are cardinals within the church trying to resolve that. But it doesn't get resolved as easily as one would like, because now there's 2 people saying that they should be the Pope. and that two people turns into three people. And so in 1407, you actually have three different popes in Europe. And if you're not with that pope, you're a heretic, and you can find yourself being under attack. So it's just such a chaotic time to be morphing through. And then finally, I can't not acknowledge this. In 1453, Mehmed II, the Mamluks that I mentioned, they grow later into being the Ottoman Empire. They actually succeed in conquering Constantinople in 1453. That's the end of the Byzantine Empire. Really kind of weird history fact. Rome in the West was lost under a Emperor Romulus, which is interesting because Rome was founded by Romulus. Constantinople falls while it's led by Constantine the 11th, and it was founded by Constantine the 1st. I could do a whole presentation just on this event, but I will not now. All right, so I just want to shift here. This is, I appreciate your patience. As I said, 500 years of history when there's a lot more things happening in the world at the same time can be a little bit more difficult to navigate through. We obviously have not been able to talk about the Renaissance. We've not been able to talk about the Spanish Inquisition or the Reconquista. We've not been able to really expand into the fullness of these subjects as much as I would prefer. But the bottom line is this. By this time, we're running into an issue where by around 1450 to 1500, the views of 1099 have grossly mutated. Let's talk about what those are. So originally, you have the idea that you can launch a crusade, which is an armed pilgrimage to recapture holy sites and prevent invasion. That gets horribly mutated into the Pope can excommunicate those that he finds politically at odds with him and then can inspire violence against them. You run into the issue of a lot of situation in which heretics have been burned at the stake, which owes to that first problem. You now have the issue that you not have just one pope, but you have three. And for quite some time, the papacy hasn't been the old papacy we knew in Rome. You also run into the problem now of something of where bishops are not seen as very different from the nobles which own lands. And in fact, the old French term for those nobles who were landlenders was villain. That's where we get the term villain from today to represent a bad guy. Then we finally have this other problem on top of it, which are indulgences. Remember, an indulgence initially is substitution for penance. Well, that sounds great, Dane. Can you break that down into layman's terms? Yes, I can. So the church has always taught if you sin, you can seek absolution from God, that you can seek to reconcile your relationship with God. That's great if you do that. That does not excuse you from the indirect karma or chaos that you've started in the world. You still need to do something to address that. And that's where repentance comes in. That's what a penance is. A penance is, what are you going to do to make this right for other people? So at the time of Pope Urban II, we can see something like the crusade being offered as a substitute for indulgence, a substitute for penance. You did these bad things, so if you do this one great thing, that will clear the debt. But now the problem is things are starting to get a lot more corrupt, and people are just outright paying money for indulgences. And when it becomes money paid for repetitive behavior, it starts to feel a lot more like bribery than it does penance. And what happens more is the church structure begins to become more powerful because of the money it's gaining from those indulgences. There's a number of things that are just creating some ethical dilemmas here. And that will lead to where we'll pick up next time with the Protestant Reformation. Eventually, you have an individual who gets so passionate about this, it's the most German thing ever. He gets so passionate about it, he writes a list and nails it to the front door of a cathedral. We'll get more into the nuances of that within the last session. We'll talk about the Protestant and English Reformations, but hopefully this helps to paint a picture of how the church changed over time and the issues that led to this sense of need for a reformation. That's all I got for you today. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yes.
I would like to point out one of the things that happened in the Crusades, it's really great for those of us of Scottish and Irish descent, is that the Middle East.
Yep.
Early pilgrims picked them up from the Middle East, brought them back, and of course improved them because that's
Absolutely. Thank you for that. One of many items of very important cultural values that came from that adventure. Yes.
Scott bagpipes are very
Thank you. Oh, and just one last note. Moving forward, when we refer to Constantinople, we will not call it Constantinople. It'll be Istanbul now. Istanbul. There's a whole song about that. If you don't believe me, look it up.